Hey everybody, Neon here, doing another video. This time I'm doing it a little bit differently because I have some topics that are really on my mind right now that was actually triggered by a comment that came on a recent video. One of the watchers said something along the lines of, hey, I've been really enjoying your stuff. I really wish I had videos like this in previous expansions. And I mean, I love getting those sorts of comments. It's always really nice. But the thought that I actually had was, I don't know if I would have been able to do this in all of the previous expansions. There have been a lot of previous expansions where there's just not that much to do, relatively speaking. There's a lot of there's not a lot of decks to really experiment with. And my mind really went back to set one metagame where there just were much fewer decks that were even remotely viable. And really at any given time, it felt like there was like maybe 5 or 6 decks that were competitive, depending on they rotated between a few different things, but maybe half a dozen decks that you really had to pay attention to. And what that actually made me think about was also like it was this paired with the feeling that I've been having recently, where it's really hard to keep on top of everything that's happening in the metagame. And I think that other people are feeling this too, that it's just really difficult to follow everything that's happening because the metagame has been so diverse and moving so quickly. So what I wanted to talk about was about the idea of specialists versus generalists, and why I think that we've moved from an age where generalists were rewarded into now an age in which specialists are rewarded. So first I'm going to back up and say, like, what does all this mean? So what is a generalist to start with, and a specialist? A generalist is somebody who, with their focus and their approach to taking on the metagame, is to have a basic level of competency with all of the different decks that are available. This gives them a lot of flexibility to play whatever is the best at a given time. A specialist says, no, I'm not going to focus on everything. I'm going to focus on a couple of things and do those really well, and then I'm going to get my edge that way. Obviously, these two approaches both have their advantages and disadvantages, so the question kind of becomes, well, which one's better and why? And ultimately, it depends on the things that are happening in the metagame in a macro sense. And the 3 factors that I really identified in thinking about this was about the range of decks that are available, the options in deck building, and the gameplay decisions. So in a small metagame, when you have fewer decks that are available, a generalist can become proficient in all of them. Like, if there's half a dozen different decks, like, you need to, play them on a daily rotation basis, and you'll still have Sunday left over to goof off. And you'll still be able to be proficient in everything. As the metagame expands like it is right now, it just becomes so much harder to keep up with all the different decks that are available. So just as a function of base, like, time kind of thing, it's very difficult to maintain a generalist attitude as the metagame expands. Next, you have to also talk about, think about the number of macro archetypes, like decks that fit into a given macro archetype. For example, back in the day, the best mid-rangey deck that was available, grindy mid-rangey deck that was available, was, in my mind, Combray. Big Combray decks that were very, very popular for a good deal of time back in early Eternal. Now though we have a bunch of grindy mid-range decks. We have Genev that is really strong. You kind of say that Winchest falls under a similar archetype here. Huru decks that the mid-rangey Huru decks that we have now also feel that they fall under that category. So I think that there's a lot more that you could kind of choose between and rotate between. If you wanted to, for instance, be a specialist in a grindy mid-range deck, like back in the day, you only could play Combray, and if that was nerfed or bad or for whatever reason based on the metagame, you're kind of stuck. Like, you didn't have a lot of options. Nowadays, you have, you could say, okay, well, Combray, big Combray is bad, I'm going to rotate to something like Huru. So that's one element. The next that I want to talk about is with the options in deck building. Let's kind of use the example of talking about the removal that is available for a Argenport style decks, controlling decks. Back in the day, we had Auric Runehammer, Suffocate, Annihilate, Deathstrike, Vanquish, and Hearth's Rule. What I say are the main ones that saw play back then. Since then, we've had a number of new cards that fall under that archetype that are available too, like Desecrate, Slay, Pristine Light, Dweezer's Office. They all fall under this category and are all effective at slightly different things and under slightly different conditions. So, like, deciding what the mix is of those cards that you want and why is going to be much more difficult if you're a generalist. If you're a specialist, you can actually put the effort in to find, like, okay, well, how many, Defiance versus Desecrates versus Pristine Lights and Harsh Rules do I want in a given deck? That's part of the reason why Harsh Rule was so popular back in the earliest days of Eternal, even in decks that probably didn't want it, because it was just, like, one of the best removal options that were available. While today, it sees a lot less play because it's just, like, the power level is not that much higher than everything else, and there's just a lot of really good cheap options to consider. This is really magnified. The deck building decision difficulty is magnified and multiplied by merchants. If you are a deck builder, you know that merchant-related deck building decisions are, like, agonizingly difficult. Like, every single slot in the market requires a lot of thought, deciding how many merchants and of what types go into your deck. Like, that's all really important, and I mean, I don't really need to reiterate this, but that's really, really hard. And only a specialist in my mind is going to be able to get that right. If you are a generalist, like, you ultimately kind of have to either take a guess or just copy somebody else's list for the market-related decisions, because that's the hardest element of deck building, I think playing the decks right and building the correct decks and getting the correct decks, and only specialists are going to be able to really nail that down and put the time necessary in to get that correct. Next is about the gameplay decisions. Gameplay has gotten a lot more complicated over the course of Eternal's history. There are a lot of mechanics that have come up over the course of time that are just much more decision intensive. We have the scout mechanic, we have the merchant mechanic, we have the site mechanic. Like, these are all really like magnify the amount of choices that you make in the course of a game. And you are not going to be making those decisions correctly if you are a generalist a lot of the time. Like, a generalist can play a deck out that you just curve out and you like, I played the most expensive card in my hand every turn, like, and hey, I won. Like, that's really a convenient approach to the game a lot of the time in a relatively thin and a relatively shallow metagame. But as we've gotten a lot further along, I just feel that the complexity of making good gameplay decisions is way more difficult, and as a result, you are going to be rewarded by knowing the decks really well and having mastery of, like, what matters where, like merchant decisions, what cards do I need to get from my market, how many power do I need to operate well, etc. Like, what matters in a given matchup. And I think the matchup thing is also really important to remember too, is because obviously it's hard to keep up as a generalist to all the different decks that are available, just because out of a function of time. But also, to be a specialist, you also really know each of your given matchups much better because you've actually played them all. Like, you've played, against Praxis and against Rakano, and again, you've played against everything with your deck, with your build. And unless you're really focusing on a given archetype, it's impossible to get that amount of time in to have that practice and background. This is particularly true about playing against decks that has specialized game plans, like combo decks, playing against Storm, playing against a Reanimator deck. Like, if you are being a generalist, you haven't played enough of those particular matchups, because it often requires very particular choices at very particular times, and if you don't know the matchup well, it really punishes you. So, and since those have become way more popular too, this is another factor I would say with the metagames. Like, the existence of those specialized decks makes a difference in how much you're rewarded to be a specialist, to respond to that and to understand that. So why am I going off about all of this? Like, why am I really talking about, what's the main point about, other than this thesis about specialists maybe being better rewarded now? What I actually wanted to talk about, as the more important idea behind this, is to address those of you in the audience who are feeling a little bit overwhelmed and a little bit confused as to what's going on in the metagame right now, in that you can't keep up with everything that's happening. There's a lot of decks to try. It's hard to try them all give them all a chance, and really figure out like what's best for you, what's best at the particulars of the metagame, especially since the metagame is moving really quickly. Like, how do you respond to a complicated metagame? What I would actually advise people to do is don't think about things quite in that way. Like, I would think of yourself as switching to saying, I am a XYZ type player, and that I try to focus on being as effective as possible in these particular types of decks. Trying to play everything well now is almost impossible. So I would rather be proficient at playing a smaller range of decks as well as possible, rather than trying to do everything well. It's just impossible to keep up with that nowadays, I think. So, and that I might think that would be freeing for some of you, saying like, you don't have to keep up with everything, you don't have to play every deck. And particularly, like, I hope that one of the things that I'm doing is to in these videos is to give people at least some level of that generalist experience, because it is so hard to keep up with everything nowadays and give you a little bit of flavor of everything. So I would really encourage you to do that. Like, obviously, people who are really good at the game, really amazing at deck building, and are putting in a lot of hours, should be able to switch between a lot of different decks, really well, and be proficient in each of them. But I just think that that's not going to be available to most players anymore. Back in the day, like back in set 1, anybody who was a high tier of players should be able to play every deck. Well, that was just a fact, and we all could. Like, there was a good number of us that are still playing now that could all play all of the good decks, and it's just not sure anymore that you can keep up with it. So I think that might be freeing for some people to hear that you can say, like, yes, you don't have to keep up with it anymore. It is better to kind of focus on a few given decks and become really, really skilled at those, rather than trying to do everything at once. So that was what I wanted to get off my chest, and it was something that I was thinking about a lot, and I thought that some of you might find it interesting. But that'll be it from me today. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll be doing another regular video of an actual deck for tomorrow. But yeah, that'll be it for me. Thank you very much.